Hi, it's Dennis Daly. I mentioned many times that one of the great thrills of doing interviews over the years is I got to meet and talk to my heroes. My heroes in broadcasting included only 3 or 4 people, and the number one had to be Fred Foy. The name may mean nothing to you, but he is best remembered for his work on The Lone Ranger. It was 1948 at WXYZ in Detroit when Fred first started.
Horse with the speed of light, a cloud of dust, and a hearty "Hi-yo Silver," the Lone Ranger.
Fred Foy's voice has deepened over the years, and his hair has turned white, and he sits across from me now, and we've got a lot to talk about. Fred, thanks for hosting us here in Reading, Massachusetts. Boy, I tell you, you listen to those old tapes of the Lone Ranger and you get misty-eyed, your hair stands up. I am just a sucker for that show, and I must tell you it's an honor to spend this time with you. What is the allure, 50 years later, young kids who weren't even born during the TV show, what is there about the Lone Ranger that still captivates us?
Well, here is the picture of the stalwart masked man, his Indian companion who actually saved his life in the ambush at Bryant's Gap, and it's that marvelous combination of the hero who fights for good and for justice, and that has certainly been one of the factors that have been the reason for its popularity. I mean, when I was with the show, I remember so many scripts that dealt with some of the historical figures out of history that with the Lone Ranger involved in some of their situations. But it's something that is missing today, I think. We need more heroes like that masked man.
In what part of history did the Lone Ranger take place? Post-Civil War?
Yes, it would. I wish I could pinpoint.
I always pictured it as the 1870s, 1880s, something in that.
Somewhere around there, because they dealt a lot with the Indians and some of the attacking tribes and so on. So it had to be around that time.
Let's talk about the cast. Brace Beamer from Southern Illinois, quite near where I grew up. You were telling me before going on the air that here was a man who was not just an actor, but Brace Beamer, in a way, lived the part of the Lone Ranger.
Oh, yes. Brace actually was a great outdoorsman. He had a farm. We sometimes refer to it as his ranch out in Oxford, Michigan, and he bred horses. He was an outdoorsman, and at his ranch he kept Silver and Scout in the stable out there, and he was an all-around. He was a great rider, and also he knew how to handle the 6 guns and rifles and whatever. And he was a handsome, tall, good-looking gentleman, and he fit the role, even though it wasn't a visual role at the time. And of course, he had the voice that really brought that character to life.
Hi-yo Silver!
Wonderful voice, and never really shot at anybody. He would shoot the gun out of their hand. He was not a nasty good guy.
That's right. No, he would always, either the gun would fly out of the hand, or he would maybe graze their shoulder, but never killed anyone. Never shot to kill anyone.
Take us back to the very beginning as to how the character of the Lone Ranger was born.
Well, in the episode that brings the Lone Ranger to life. To make it brief, there's a group of Texas Rangers, and they are trailing Butch Cavendish and his gang of outlaws. And they send a scout ahead who tells them, we must go through the canyon, and they are camped on the other side and whatever, and we can deal with them there. So as they approach and go through Bryant's Gap, the outlaws are on either side of the canyon, ready to ambush all of the Rangers as they go forth. this happens, they're ambushed, and they leave all rangers to be dead. Then they ride away, and dusk arrives, and an Indian riding through suddenly sees the massacre and walks through, and suddenly finds that one man is still alive. So he takes the ranger and takes him to his cave and nurses him back to health, and finally...
There were 6 of us in that canyon. The others. What about the other rangers?
Other ranger. All dead.
Dead. One was my brother.
You, only ranger left. You, Lone Ranger.
Finally, in the final analysis, he says, well, I want to trail these men. I want to get every one of them, and conceal my identity. That's it, a mask. I'll wear a mask.
With your help, Tonto, I'll get every one of those crooks.
In the ranger's eyes, there was a light that must have burned in the eyes of knights in armor. A light that through the ages lifted the souls of strong men who fought for justice, for God.
I'll be the Lone Ranger.
The companionship began there between the two, and they went out to hunt down the Cavendish gang. Eventually, they get the gang, and Butch Cavendish goes to jail. And then in the 20th anniversary episode, which is a beautiful episode, it covers all of the beginnings of how he became the Lone Ranger, and then he's talking to his nephew Dan Reed, telling him all that has happened previously, and they are sort of on a little ride into the outlands when suddenly there are rifle shots and they're attacked, and it turns out, of course, that it's Butch Cavendish who has escaped from jail and is now out to get the ranger. To make a long story short again, they finally confront each other, and there's a tremendous fight on a hillside, and in the fight, finally, Butch Cavendish goes over the cliff, and Tonto and the ranger go down to where he has fallen, and they find that he's still alive. And the scene, the ranger is talking to him, and he says, I want you to know who found you. And he said, the first time the ranger takes his mask off, and Cavendish says, you, and so on, and then he knows who his champion of justice was, and he passes on.
What was the relationship between the Lone Ranger and Tonto? I mean, even though Tonto spoke in what maybe people today may say is not very politically correct, stereotypical language, but yet Tonto played an integral part in that show. I mean, he was given some very important duties to do. It would seem that you were kind of striking a positive blow there for the feelings we have about American Indians.
Oh yes, no, they were not. It was not like he wasn't a servant. He was a companion, and they worked together in all of their adventures.
You, me, pledged friendship many years ago.
This is a good time to renew that pledge.
Kimasabi, long as you live, long as me live, me ride with you.
Yes, Tonto. I couldn't carry on without you. As long as we ride, we'll travel together.
I don't know about you, but that gives me goosebumps. Fred, I think you told me in an earlier interview that Tonto was played by a person who was very unlikely for the part.
Well, John Todd, when I began with the show, was already up in years and a lovely gentleman. But John was an Irishman, and he was an ex-Shakespearean actor. And here he is playing the stalwart Indian Tonto. But John was a lot of fun, and he also was sort of at a point in his life when if he wasn't too active in a show and had very few scenes, in his special chair, he would aptly doze off occasionally. So we were always alerted to keep our eye on John. But as it would happen, in one instance, I had introduced the scene which involved Brace and Tonto, and suddenly we look and John is not coming to the microphone. In fact, he's asleep. So they try to get him up there before Brace is finished with his opening line, and John awakes and drops his script, and it's all over the floor, so there's no way you can get him up there. And so Brace did the entire scene as a soliloquy. He was speaking to himself, answering his own questions.
Now, when you were associated with the Lone Ranger, and starting in 1948, the show had been on the air for a while, but it was in an era before we really were not using tape recording. We now have what are called cartridges where you just pop it in. I mean, everything is digital now. We've even gone to a generation beyond that. But tell us about the complexity involved in putting the sound effects for all of this on the air.
The show was always live while I was there. There was never a moment that anything was recorded. Many people would say, well, that opening you do on every show, that was recorded, right? No, that was live every night from top to bottom. The show was live. The sound effects were terrific. I mean, we had a fine sound effects department. They created everything possible to make the show sound as uniquely Western as possible.
We'd have made it if it hadn't been for the storm.
What a Christmas Eve.
Snowbound. In a stable. And with no way to reach a doctor.
Oh, darling. If there were only something we could do for him, John.
I'm sure it's appendicitis. He needs a doctor. I'll start the fire. It should warm up in a minute. I'll get some straw.
They had the boxes they used for the hoof beats, and they had like in one box it'd be gravel, one would have sand, and depending where the horses were moving on what terrain, that's the area they would use, and it was done by two sound men, each having little short-handled bathroom plungers to act as the hoof beats, and it sounded great. Another thing, they had a bathtub in the sound room, which they would fill like halfway with water, and where you had a scene where the outlaws or Tonto or whoever were walking through a stream, they would put on these rubber boots. A microphone was right over the bathtub, and the director would cue them, and they would walk in the water, and it sounded exactly as if you were going through the stream. They were clever. They had all sorts of unique ideas of how to duplicate sounds. A lot of the important sounds, such as gunshots, were recorded. They took a sound crew out to Brace Beamer's farm, and he would fire his rifles and 6 guns and whatever, and they recorded all this right on the scene to have it to get a real honest sound of the gunshots, and that's what they used for recorded gunshots. In all the time that I did the show, I cannot think of one incident where the gentleman running those recorded sounds and so on ever reached the point where it really was all completely falling apart.
If you let go of the turntable and that gunshot isn't there, it makes it a little hard to explain why the fellow's gun was knocked out of his hand.
Well, there were moments, not so much with sound, but I know that, you've heard this story so many times about waiting for the gunshot and it doesn't come, and then the actor suddenly says, well, all right, give me that knife. Once you're live, you have to go on regardless.
The casts and crews were doing the Lone Ranger, but also the Green Hornet and also Sergeant Preston, which I think is another wonderful example of radio. Paul Sutton, who was Sergeant Preston, was a magnificent actor.
Who are you?
Sergeant Preston, Northwest Mounted Police. She's been ill with pneumonia.
Pneumonia? Oh, yeah, now I remember.
And maybe you can explain something to me.
What do you mean?
When I found you here, you were out of food and the wood box was empty.
He was in an awful lot of Hollywood movies, not having any, major supporting role, but certainly working in the movie scene. And Paul was, again, just as much an outdoorsman, so to speak, and a stalwart character as Brace was. I mean, he played Preston to the hilt, and he had the voice to go along with it. Paul was, again, there's so many of them that you wish they could still be around to speak for themselves.
We've been talking about some of the great moments of the Lone Ranger program and some of the great people who populated the studios of WXYZ in Detroit. And one of them, Fred, was an actor with a really unusual voice. His name was Paul Hughes.
That's my name.
Is it true that you're a friend of the Lone Ranger?
Yep.
I have an important message for the masked man.
Just leave a message with me and I'll give it to the Lone Ranger's Indian pal. He'll be here soon.
No, I must see the Lone Ranger. It's a matter of life and death. His death.
Doggone. A matter of life and death. I wonder what he meant.
Paul was, again, number one, a marvelous actor, and I remember him telling me that the only serial role he ever had was on The Ranger when they one script, he played the role of Thunder Martin, and opposite Elaine Alpert, an actress who was also fine on the show, and they had her as a character called Clarabelle Hornblow, and they developed the thing as a Wallace Beery,
Marjorie Main
kind of thing, right? And he said there were many scripts following where they used the Thunder Martin and so on, and Paul said that was the only time he ever had a serial role. Paul would play that's right, the bad guy, and whatever. And he also was a sheriff, whatever, you name it. He was they were all versatile. But Paul, I'm always asked about Paul because he had such a distinctive voice. And they'd say, oh, yeah, who was that? And, well, that's who it was.
In a way, I wish I didn't have such a good ear, because as I listen to those classic radio dramas, I say to myself, oh, that's John Daner. Or that's Parley Bear or Howard McNear, and I kind of get stuck for a minute thinking who the voices are when I should be concentrating on what the plot is.
Well, listen, I was so fortunate, really, to be associated with the Lone Ranger, and especially that show, and also the Hornet and Sergeant Preston, and be able to work with a wonderful stock company of actors who were so versatile and talented. And we had a marvelous time with the show. We really did. You loved to go to work in those days.
I hope you haven't been asked this one too many times, but I get the impression that even though the Lone Ranger particularly is so much a part of the American psyche, so much a part of our memory, and new memories for young people, that when you were doing it, even though it was fun, it was an assignment. I mean, I get the impression that at the time you had no idea that here, 50 years later, you would be sitting down with the reporter still talking about this.
No, you're right. When I started doing the show, as you say, it was a special show because I left staff announcing to become part of that show and part of the Trendle Campbell outfit, but I never, for some reason, you do the show, and because we were doing it in Detroit on Jefferson Avenue out of a studio, I never had the feeling that we were going anywhere beyond the boundaries of Detroit. I mean, yes, I never felt that we were going anywhere, and we do the show, and that was it. You'd come in, do the show, and wonderful. A good show, fine. And then it was later on when the show finally went off as a live show, and then finally I picked up my bags and left Detroit and went into New York and started knocking on doors. And I would go into an agency and be interviewed by one of their casting people, and we'd sit down and start talking, and they'd say, for heaven's sake, that sounds familiar, that voice, your voice. And I said, well, oh, for heaven's sake, of course, the Lone Ranger. That was the first time that I realized that this show had gone beyond the boundaries of Detroit, and people did hear me beyond those environs, and it was amazing.
I guess the fan mail and much of the other things associated with the show were going to ABC or Mutual in New York. You're right. You were out there feeding it in. Was it done a second time for the West Coast, or was there but a single performance?
No, originally, before I joined the show, in the earlier days, they used to do the 7:30 show, and then they'd have to be there till 10:30 at night to do another live show. When I began, we would start at 7 o'clock and do a half hour of the show, the air show, which was fed to Chicago for recording. And then 30 seconds later, we would hit the network with the same show, so that actually the show that went to Chicago was to be played to the West Coast.
But you were turning around. I mean, you had to do the closing of the show and then take a deep breath, and then the William Tell overture would roll again, and you'd start over.
That's right.
Not even time to go down the hall.
No. In other words, from 7 to 8, you were there, and we'd start the show, and there were no commercials in the feed for recording from 7 to 7:30. So it would be 7:29:30, 30 seconds to go. You'd get ready. You'd go into get your General Mills commercial copy, and bang, you were on the air again for General Mills. So it was. And what could get hairy about this is that if the show going, the 7 o'clock show going to Chicago happened to be short, the writers would add a couple of scenes, a page or a couple of scenes. Fine, that was good for that show. But now when you got to the 7:30 show network, in that 30 seconds, you better pull out those extra pages and get rid of them, you know. And that happened many. Either you'd get extra pages or they would pull a couple of scenes out. And then when you went, they'd have to hand you those pages back to go in the script. So it could be a little hairy at times.
Did you ever have a show which was running long, that they just had to do something disastrous to get it over at the end? Because a lot of people have never stopped to think about it, and I first learned it as a young disc jockey. The clock eats you up. I mean, you can't reach up there and stop the clock and buy extra time.
No, in all the time I was there, that never happened. In other words, we'd have a dress rehearsal where they would time that show down to the split second, including commercials. That never happened. But earlier, they told me stories about the fact that when James Jewell was directing the show in the earlier days, that one evening, and this was before my time, they were running long, and they told me that Jimmy Jewell would come in the studio and they'd be at the mic and he'd put his hand over the actor's mouth to stop him while he pulled a page out and then pointed to the next line, and the guy would pick it up there. So that was like on-the-air cutting.
And even though, Fred, you were the narrator and provider of the continuity on that show, for one brief, shining moment, you were the Lone Ranger.
That's right. That, to me, is a high point in my career. I was understudy for Brace Beamer. Mr. Trendle asked me to be his understudy, which I thought marvelous. You know, I'll be stepping in for him now and then. Well, that never happened. All it allowed was for Brace to miss the earlier rehearsal and come in for production, and I just read his lines in the opening production. At any rate, one day, Brace arrived at the studio, and he was talking like this, and laryngitis. No way. So by God, I couldn't believe it. They said, "Okay, Fred, you're going to do the Ranger tonight," and so. And J. Michael was going to announce the show and replace me as the narrator. And oh Lord, I couldn't believe it. I had, the first thing is rush to the phone and get the family. Hello, catch this one. And I went on, and it was a thrill, really, and got a lot of compliments about it, but never heard the show. I thought, well, over the years I tried to find the show somewhere along the way, and I thought, well, what happened was they probably didn't have Chicago recorded so that there wouldn't be any, anyone else playing the Ranger. Well, lo and behold, this organization, Spurdvac, out in Los Angeles, who are one of the great groups in keeping the Golden Age alive, suddenly one fine day said, "Fred, look what we found." And there was the show in which I played the part of the Ranger. And I finally heard it, and I really have been thrilled to death with that.
A few miles from Pecos, the Lone Ranger and his Indian companion Tonto rode leisurely along the trail that bordered the Bar F Ranch.
Look, Kimasabi. Little squaw and pony waiting near entrance to ranch.
She's already seen us, Tonto. I hope my mask doesn't frighten her.
Hello, mister.
Hello, little girl. Oh, who's over there?
Oh.
Are you an outlaw?
No, Sally.
Why do you wear that mask, mister?
I have my reasons, Sally.
At the time, did you see it as strictly a children's show? Did you have an idea in your mind as to what the audience would be? Because now it's a very adult audience that's listening to this.
Oh, yeah. No, I'll be honest with you. I did not. The reason I didn't is because I remember specifically that, bless their hearts, my dad and my grandfather I would pop over to that side of town where the studios were, and the old homestead was on that side of town, and drop the family off to visit with my dad and mother, and I'd come back to pick them up, and my dad and grandfather had been listening to the show, right? So I never really zeroed it in as a kid show. I felt that there was a real adult audience out there too.
Well, you go to New York, and I associated you with the Lone Ranger, but there were two wonderful sounds on ABC radio that I remember, one of which was a weekly show that wrapped up the week called The Voices in the Headlines.
Oh, yes.
H. Paul Jeffers was the producer. Tell us about him, if you will, and I just think that was one of the best wrap-up shows ever done in radio. The sound was just perfect.
I remember that well. We do that every Sunday, and Paul was a marvelous writer and a marvelous producer, and he wrote some great narrative scripts that were just beautiful to do. You're going to mention it, I know, but one of the finest things we did together was a series called The Eagle and the Bear about the Cold War, and just beautifully written, and I enjoyed so much doing the narrative on those shows. They were so well done and well put together.
The gates to Berlin swung shut. A city of more than 2 million people was completely cut off from the Western world. Or was it? While the Soviets cut off the land and water routes to Berlin, Allied aircraft were still flying through the air corridors from the west to Berlin's Tempelhof Airport, while the gates were shut by the Russian bear on the ground. The Eagles were still flying, but no one knew whether the Russians would try to interfere with the flights. It became a major crisis.
The Eagle and the Bear is narrated by Fred Foy. This is Bill Brophy inviting you to hear The Red Menace, the fifth program of The Eagle and the Bear.
When we think about radio, we think about a specific sound. I jump ahead of myself. Even in television, the late Ernie Anderson, who's the one who said The Love Boat, and he did the ABC announcing. Networks develop on television a visual logo, a visual presentation. On radio, of course, it was all sound. On ABC, it used to be that bum, 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 bum when the newscast came on, and the shows ended with what we called system cues.
Go with Paul Harvey to the heart of the news. Weekdays on the ABC Radio Network.
That was kind of the quintessential sound of ABC radio for a long time.
Yes, right. We had a marvelous announcing staff at ABC. We really did. And the thrill of my life when I arrived at ABC and became part of the staff was.
May I guess? I'm sorry to keep interrupting you. Meeting Milton Cross.
You got it. What a beautiful man, really. It was a thrill to meet him, and we became very good friends. He's just the nicest man you could ever want to meet, and as knowledgeable about opera as anyone you'd ever want to know. But he was just a gem of a person, and that was one of the real thrills of joining the staff.
I don't know why I knew that, but when you said whom you would meet, he was the one person. But you had Art Van Horn and Don Gardner. I remember him as announcing Kennedy's death on the radio.
Yes, I was there. I remember.
Clint Hill, a Secret Service agent assigned to Mrs. Kennedy, said, and I quote, "He is dead." That is what Clint Hill, a Secret Service agent assigned to Mrs. Kennedy, said today. He is dead.
I remember Don doing a terrific job in the booth.
It's really tough to listen to even today. Well, we'll lighten things up after the break. I'm Dennis Daly. You and I get together every weekend. My special guest, my host here in the suburbs of beautiful Boston, Massachusetts, is Fred Foy, a man who has left an indelible mark on the history of American broadcasting, his narrations for the Lone Ranger, and his magnificent work with the American Broadcasting Company. By the way, many of the clips from The Lone Ranger are on a wonderful cassette that Fred has put together, the Fred FOY collection, Meanwhile Back at the Ranch. And if you'd like to find out how to get it, let me give our post office box number here on the program. Post office box 26223, Los Angeles 90026. Box 26223, Los Angeles 90026. Fred, just a few minutes remaining. You have watched broadcasting for a lot of years. What has happened? I mean, there just doesn't seem to be anything you can sit down and listen to or watch with Grandma and the kids anymore. It's a whole different world. How do you view the changes that have occurred? We're not in that kinder, gentler era anymore.
We progress so far that all that we can be involved in is situations that promote violence or violent behavior, and all of the shows that seem to come on now, and of course they're not directed, as they say, at the children, but the children are there, and they're aware of how the dials work. But I would like so much to see, it's a shame when you sit back and listen to some of the marvelous shows that were produced on radio, and that had some sense of right and wrong and goodness to them, without having to resort, as you say, to unnecessary and unbelievable violence. I don't know, where it can go. If these things, if something could be developed that could bring all of that back, it would be a wonderful thing to see. But I don't know.
What does it feel like for you when someone comes up to you, maybe even a small child, 2 generations away from what we refer to as the golden age of radio, and realize who you are, and that sound that epitomizes much of that era? What does it feel like for you to almost have a third career now based upon people's memories of all of this?
Well, it's very rewarding, believe me, and it's humbling, and it's in a way it's hard to believe. As I said, we thought that we were just doing a show and a job on the air, and then to later find out it's become part of legend. That it's really then you feel how fortunate you were to have been a part of it, and all the people that were involved in it. It just was a wonderful time, and I really feel quite humble when I find out that people think that much of the show and my part in it.
I know you've been asked the same questions 1,000 times. Is there anything you haven't been asked you'd like to talk about?
I don't think so. I think they seem to have covered every base on that one, really.
I want to thank you for taking the time. You brought all of us a lot of joy. You still are, and for those who... I don't think there are 3 people in the English-speaking world probably who haven't heard your voice at least once.
Well, Dennis, thanks a million. I appreciate it, and, well, I hope to be going on for quite a while yet.
Fred, how about one more time for old time's sake?
A fiery horse with the speed of light, a cloud of dust, and a hearty hi-yo silver. Easy, steady, big fellow. Hi-yo silver!
The gentleman of broadcasting, one of the most recognizable voices in the English-speaking world, the late Fred FOY.
The Lone Ranger rides again.
I'm Dennis Daly.